On the 3rd of September 1946, in a courtroom on the grounds of Dachau, an American court read a German sergeant his rights. The sergeant's name was Erwin Metz. 18 months earlier, he had been in charge of 350 American prisoners at a place called Berga, and more than 70 of them never came home. So the court told him what he was entitled to: a copy of the charge against him, the right to be present, the right to see the evidence and question the witnesses, the right to call his own, and the right to a lawyer. Nobody wrote down what Erwin Metz expected when they brought him into that room. "I am not going to invent it for you, and you should be suspicious of anybody who does." What I can tell you is what he got instead, because that part is on paper, and the paper is sitting in a box in Maryland right now. A bullet closes a case. A trial opens a file. That sentence is the whole video, and the file is going to turn out to be a stranger object than you expect. It is the reason this case is not a rumor. It also got two important things wrong, and one of them the court never mentioned at all. Give me half an hour, and I will hand you the whole thing, the part America should be proud of, and the part it should not. Start where the 350 started, because none of them were supposed to be there. They were captured in the Ardennes, in the German offensive that opened on the 16th of December, 1944. The charge sheet that came out of all this does not name them. It calls them unknown members of the United States Army. They came off the line in columns and went east in boxcars, and they ended up at a prisoner of war camp near the spa town of Bad Orb, in the hills northeast of Frankfurt. On the German ledger, it was Stalag IX-B. Thousands of Americans passed through it that winter. Bad Orb was miserable, and it was legal. That distinction is going to matter, so hold it. A prisoner of war camp operates under written rules. And while the food at Bad Orb was thin and the barracks were cold and the men were sick, the men were, on paper, prisoners of war, and the papers still meant something. At the end of January, that stopped. The guards turned the American prisoners out and formed them up, and an order was given in German. Alle Juden, einen Schritt vorwarts, all Jews, one step forward. Somewhere between 80 and 130 men stepped forward. Call it about 100. It was not enough. So the guards walked the ranks and picked the rest themselves. Men who looked Jewish to them, men whose names sounded Jewish to them, men who had made trouble, men the camp had decided were undesirable for some other reason nobody bothered to write down. They kept going until they had exactly 350. There is a detail here that gets worse the longer you look at it. American dog tags in that war carried a letter for the soldiers' religion: C for Catholic, P for Protestant, H for Hebrew. A tag was a thing the Army gave you so that if the worst happened, somebody could tell your mother. In a yard in Germany in January of 1945, it did the other job. What a man did with a tag stamped H in that yard, in that week, is not something anybody wrote down. And a good number of the ones who ended up in that column of 350 were not Jewish at all, which is its own kind of statement about the sorting. On the 9th of February, they were marched to a siding and loaded into boxcars, and for 4 days they went east with no food and no water worth the name, standing because there was no room to do anything else. On the 13th of February, 1945, the doors opened at a small town on a river in Thuringia, Berga on the Elster. Berga was not a prisoner of war camp. Berga was a subcamp of Buchenwald. It had been set up on the 13th of November 1944 under the codename Schwalbe V, and its purpose was to put a war plant underground where bombers could not reach it. That meant tunnels. 17 of them driven into the hillside above the river. Slave labor dug them. In all, more than 3,000 prisoners passed through the place, most of them Jews, the largest group of them Hungarian. The camp memorial at Buchenwald records 315 deaths there in 5 months, and a burial ground at Bad where they went. That was the establishment the American prisoners were handed to. They worked the tunnels in the clothes they had been captured in. The resolution that a congressman would one day introduce about them puts it in flat official language. Without proper masks, overcoats, or protective footwear. Understand the swap that has just happened. These men were still legally prisoners of war. They were now being fed on a concentration camp ration and worked on a concentration camp shift inside a concentration camp alongside concentration camp prisoners. No rule anywhere allowed that. It simply happened, and the men it happened to were in no position to file a complaint. A fair warning here, and I would rather give it now than have you feel ambushed later. For most of this video, the United States is going to look very good. It investigated something nobody was making it investigate, and then it built a court and read a man his rights. About 10 minutes from now, that stops. The story turns, and I am not going to soften the turn or bury it at the end where you might miss it. If you only want the flattering half, this is an honest place to get off, and I mean that with no hard feelings. If you want the whole file instead, subscribe. That is the only promise I can make about what comes next. Then they started dying. They died of the things the charge sheet would later list one by one. No food, no water, no medicine, no shelter. And the tunnels. One man was shot. His name was Morton Goldstein, and he had gotten out and been recaptured, and the version the camp gave was that he was killed trying to escape again. We know what a witness thought of that version because he wrote it down that night in a diary he was not allowed to have. Corporal Anthony Acevedo, a medic, Company B, 275th Infantry Regiment, 70th Infantry Division. He kept a small book hidden through the whole thing and used it to record names and how each man died, which is a job somebody in that place had decided was worth being shot over. His entry reads, "Goldstein's body was returned here today for burial. He was shot while attempting to re-escape." So they say. But actually, he was recaptured and shot through the head. That diary exists. It is not a family story. It is at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, catalogued with the armband he wore, a cross woven out of a palm leaf, his prayer missal, and photographs. He drew in it as well. A man losing 60 pounds kept writing because the whole point was that somebody else would have to read it. He went from 149 pounds to 87. In the first week of April, the Germans emptied the camp and marched them 15 to 20 miles a day for more than 150 miles south into Bavaria, away from the Americans coming east. Men who fell out of the column did not rejoin it. Acevedo's entry from the road is 1 sentence long, and it is the loudest thing in the book. This isn't very good for our sick men. On the 20th of April, the 90th Infantry Division reached Berga and freed the men too sick to have been marched. 3 days later, near Cham, the 11th Armored Division came up on the column itself. Acevedo wrote one more line and underlined it twice. "We were liberated today, April the 23rd, 1945. More than 70 of the 350 were dead, roughly 1 in 5. The journalist Roger Cohen, who spent years on this and interviewed the men while they were still alive to be interviewed, puts the figure at 73 or more, 21%, in the space of 10 weeks, and calls it the highest rate of attrition among American prisoners of war in Europe. Set that against the ordinary number, because the contrast is the argument. Close to 94,000 American soldiers and airmen were held in more than 50 permanent camps across Europe and the Mediterranean in that war. About 99% of them came home. That is the crime. What I actually brought you here for is what a country does next, and that part almost never gets told, because a tunnel photographs well, and a courtroom does not. The United States could have done nothing. The men were liberated, the war in Europe ended 2 weeks later, and the world had a great deal on its mind in the spring of 1945. Nobody was going to notice one work detail in Thuringia. Somebody noticed anyway. A war crimes investigating team went to Berga, took evidence, and built a case. And on the 3rd of September 1946, at Dachau, a general military government court opened proceedings in a matter titled United States versus Erwin Metz and others. Look at the two men in the dock, because they are not who you picture. Erwin Metz was a Home Guard sergeant. Before the war, he had been a bank official and then a factory manager. He was the one on the ground, in charge of the American work detail, the man the prisoners saw every day. Ludwig Merz was a captain, Metz's superior, and before the war he had been a schoolteacher. A bank official and a schoolteacher. Neither of them was anywhere near the top of the Reich. And hold on to that, because it is almost the exact word the United States government is going to use when it lets them out. The charges were written down and broken into counts. Metz was charged with the killing of an unknown member of the United States Army, and separately with assault. Both men were charged with mistreating prisoners by, and I am reading the language of the charge, failing to provide adequate food, adequate drinking water, adequate medical care, adequate clothing, and adequate housing and sanitary facilities. Said failure resulting in the death of several unknown members of the United States Army. That is a document, not a summary. It is in Record Group 153 at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. Read that description again and notice what it is doing. It is not calling them monsters. It is listing, item by item, the things a man in charge of prisoners is obliged to hand them, and stating that he did not. And on the first morning, before any of that was argued, the court did for Erwin Metz exactly what it did for every defendant it tried in that series. It asked him his name, his age, where he lived, what he was a citizen of. Then it read him his rights. A copy of the charge, the right to be present at his own trial, the right to examine the evidence and the witnesses, the right to call witnesses of his own, and the right to a lawyer, either one the American forces would provide or one of his own choosing. 4 things and a 5th. Keep count of them, because we are going to come back and see which ones actually held. The chief prosecutor of the Dachau trial series, William Denson, put that standard in his own words, and I want you to hear how unglamorous it is. Each man has a right to a hearing, has a right to confrontation, has a right to be represented by counsel, and to know on his arraignment that he had the perfect right to enter a plea of not guilty, and if he did not plead, the plea of not guilty was entered for him, which thereupon automatically cast upon the government the obligation of proving the offense charged beyond all reasonable doubt. The government has to prove it. Against a man charged with starving American prisoners to death, in a court run by the country those prisoners came from. I want to be careful here because there is a cheap version of this video, and I am not making it. That was not a civilian court, and it was not a perfect one. There was no jury. It took sworn written statements in place of live testimony. It was a military government court operating in a wrecked country under occupation, and it was built for speed. But the things it did give him, it gave him on the record, and he used them. Metz took the stand and blamed the American medics. His own words, out of the transcript. They bore the sole responsibility for the medical care. I ask you, who must bear the responsibility? The answer is obvious: the U.S. medics. He meant men like Anthony Acevedo, who had no medicine, and who was writing their names in a notebook because there was nothing else he could do for them. Then Metz blamed Merz. Merz blamed a third man named Willie Hack, who was not in that courtroom and who would eventually be hanged, though not by the United States. Both were convicted. On the 15th of October, 1946, 6 weeks after it opened, the court sentenced Erwin Metz and Ludwig Merz to death by hanging. And this is the place I warned you about. Start with the thing that went wrong inside the courtroom while everybody was doing their job properly. Not one American survivor was called to testify in person. Not one. The court worked from 12 written statements, taken by the investigating team, added to the file. And dozens of the survivors had already told a lawyer named Charles Vogel, who had made this his business, that they would come. They would have flown. They would have stood up in that room and pointed. The court did not send for them, and the record does not say why. Second, the court did not know what Berga was. In the trial, and in the Army's own review of the trial afterward, Berga is treated as a satellite of the prisoner of war camp system, an offshoot of a Stalag. It was not. It was a subcamp of Buchenwald, and it says so on the memorial that stands there today. The Buchenwald prisoners who dug those tunnels beside the Americans, the men who died there by the hundreds, were never mentioned in that courtroom at all. And third, following from the second, the prosecution paid very little attention to the evidence that these particular 350 had been picked out because they were Jewish, or because somebody thought they were. The case was filed with the prisoner of war cases. It was tried as a violation of the laws of war, count by count, food and water and medicine and shelter. Which it was. It was also the other thing, and the other thing did not make it into the record. Hold that, because it comes back. The sentences went up for review, which in that system was not an appeal. There was no appeals court. There was a mandatory review by the judge advocate, and there was the possibility of a petition for clemency. In September of 1947, the review came back, and the death sentences stood. The reviewing document is dated the 15th of September 1947, out of the Deputy Judge Advocate's Office, 7708 War Crimes Group, European Command. Then, on the 11th of June, 1948, Charles Vogel opened a letter. It was from the Civil Affairs Division, War Crimes Branch. Erwin Metz's death sentence had been commuted to life. Ludwig Merz's death sentence had been commuted to 5 years. The letter gave reasons, and this is why the file matters, because we do not have to guess at them. The two men were described as underlings, and of Metz, the letter said he was, and I am quoting it, though guilty of a generally cruel course of conduct toward prisoners, not directly responsible for the death of any prisoners, except one who was killed during the course of an attempt to escape. Except one. That one was Morton Goldstein, the man Acevedo wrote about by lamplight. Metz's sentence was cut again to 15 years. He was paroled in 1954. By 1955, both men were free. The commutation is not the part of this I want you to carry out of here. What I want you to carry is who screamed about it. Charles Vogel and the families of the dead did not accept that letter. They wrote back. They circulated a petition and sent it to the President of the United States, to the Secretary of Defense, and to the Secretary of State, to Truman, to Forrestal, to Marshall. And it asked them, in these words, to use your full powers to procure at least a retrial to which American GI survivors can be sent to testify if direct reversal of the commutation of their sentences cannot be obtained. so that these two barbaric murderers can receive the full justice they merit by American standards. By American standards. Read that phrase again. These were the families of the dead, and they did not ask for those two men to be taken out and shot. They asked for a retrial. They asked for the survivors to be allowed to testify. They wanted the procedure to be run properly, because they believed the procedure was the thing that made it justice and not revenge. They did not get it. And a man who has spent about 30 years hunting Nazi war criminals, Ephraim Zuroff, has an explanation for the era that produced that letter, and it is worth hearing as one named man's judgment, rather than as settled fact. He says the American government commuted sentences and released hundreds of war criminals as the Cold War sharpened. In his words, they were more concerned about keeping out communists than admitting victims of the Nazis. There is one more piece, and it is the one the survivors never forgave. When they were finally coming home, each man was handed a form to sign. It had an official name: Security Certificate for Ex-Prisoners of War. The stated reason on the paper was to protect the interests of American prisoners of war still in Japanese camps and future operations. What the man signed was a promise never to reveal, discuss, publish, or otherwise disclose to unauthorized persons information on escape from enemy prison camps. And it added that the authorship of stories or articles on these subjects is specifically forbidden. Read narrowly, that is a form about escapes. Read by a soldier who has just come back from a place where his friends were worked to death and who is being handed something to sign before he can go home, it is not narrow at all. Acevedo's account of what he understood it to mean is one sentence long. We weren't to open our mouths. Most of them did not talk about it for decades. The Army's position, given in 2009 by Major General Vincent Bowles, is that the form was only ever meant to cover escapes and the people who had helped men escape. His exact words: "We didn't explain it correctly, and it was construed as a secrecy document which they could never talk about." Anthony Acevedo did not accept that explanation, and he was not the only one who refused it. Both positions are on the record, and I am giving you both because both are real. The recognition, when it came late, and it came small. In December of 2007, a congressman named Joe Baca introduced a resolution honoring the men detained at Berga. The text is good. It says, "The House recognizes and expresses its appreciation for the courageous and loyal contributions made by the soldiers detained in Berga," and it puts the number of dead into the congressional record. It went to the Committee on Armed Services and it never passed. It is still sitting there. What actually happened in a hotel ballroom in Orlando, Florida, on the 6th of June, 2009, 64 years and 6 weeks after the liberation. In front of about 100 elderly former prisoners of war and their families, 6 Berga survivors were handed an American flag that had been flown over the Pentagon. Private Samuel Farrer, who had been a medic, was given a Bronze Star. Major General Bowles said the sentence out loud that the courtroom in 1946 never managed to say. It wasn't a prison camp, it was a slave labor camp. 16 survivors did not come. Anthony Acevedo was one of them. He was angry that after 64 years the ceremony was in a hotel in Florida instead of in Washington. He had a point, and he had earned the right to make it. What is the honest verdict on the country in this story? The United States did not shoot Erwin Metz on the spot, and it could have. It sent investigators to a hillside in Thuringia when nobody was watching. It wrote out a charge sheet that listed food and water and medicine as things a man owes his prisoners. It read a bank official from the Home Guard his rights, told him he could have a lawyer, one the American forces would provide or one of his own choosing, made its own government carry the burden of proof, let him stand up and insult the American medics on the record, convicted him anyway, and then wrote every bit of it down. Then it cut the sentence, and then it let him out in 1954. And when the sentences were cut, the loudest objection came from Americans, and what those Americans demanded was not a firing squad, it was a proper trial. That is not a small thing about a country. That is close to the whole thing. A bullet closes a case. A trial opens a file, and the file is why you know any of this. It is why we have the charge in its own words and the commutation in its own words, and the reason for the commutation in its own words, including the sentence that reduced Morton Goldstein to except one. And the same file is the reason we can stand here and say the court called Berga the wrong thing and never once mentioned the men from Buchenwald who were dying in the same tunnels. Nobody made a record of that mistake except the people making it. They wrote down the parts that did not flatter them, and 80 years later that is what lets us grade them. Now the part I need from you, and it is different from what I usually ask. Every one of these videos, I ask you for something a record can confirm. A name, a unit, a town, a number. Today I want the opposite. Somewhere in your family there is a piece of the war that never made it into any file at all. The thing he said once at a kitchen table in 1970 and never said again. The reason he would not eat a certain food. The name he asked about, out loud, at the very end. Nobody wrote it down. So write it down here. Put it in the comments. And put it in his words if you have them. Because the only archive that thing has ever had is you.